This is Civilization V, a game released in 2010 that pushed the Civilization franchise into the mainstream and is widely regarded as a gaming masterpiece. But after its run of 6 years with DLC updates and expansions, the new game in the series, Civilization VI, was released and something strange happened. You see, you would think that a new game coming out a half-decade later would dominate its previous entry, even when compared with something seen as a classic, like Oblivion, which only has 800 average players, and this trend is more pronounced in strategy games. No one plays Hearts of Iron 3 or EU3 anymore. Even Civilization 4, 2 years after Civ 5's launch, only had 270 players. But Civilization 5, 14 years after its release, without so much as an update, still has around 15,000 average players. To put that into perspective, a game that was almost closer to the fall of the Soviet Union than it is to today has more average players than EU4. A game that is getting a new update next month and is about 40% of the player count of Civilization 6. And with all the online discourse about how much Civ 5 was better than Civ 6, I decided I had to analyze why Civilization 5 is still so popular, and in my opinion, I've come up with 5 key factors: tone, leaders, depth, AI, and community. I'll also answer which game I think is better at the end of the video, but for now, smash that like button like you were a Civ 5 player who accidentally opened Civ 6, and let's answer those questions together. Before we get started though, watch this. Now watch this. Strategy games are mainly played by people who are interested in history. That's not groundbreaking, and by watching both intros you can immediately see which game would appeal to those types of people. The tone set by the music and art style is one of the main reasons why so many people stuck with Civ 5. When you watch Civ 5 with its more realistic approach, you see something like this, which is meant to symbolize man creating something greater than themselves, being a civilization. And with the music, you can only really feel small in comparison to the march of history this game is so known for. Now when you open Civilization 6, it's still similar music, then you open the game and find a caricature of, is that supposed to be Gandhi?
That's gotta be racist, there's no way.
Just from the intro you can tell they're not only going a different route, but for a different audience, and that is only reinforced with the most complained about change from Civ 5 to Civ 6 to this day, being the graphics. In Civ 5, the in-game animations are more basic, more prone to bugging out, and in general are not as smooth or even as good as the game that came out 6 years later. Civ 6 has better animations, more vibrant colors, and more diverse in leader appearances. So when people say they think the graphics in Civ 5 are better, what is it that they're talking about? Well, they're not so much talking about graphics as much as art style. You see, while graphics become dated, art style is forever. It more often than not helps set the tone of a game. For example, Red Dead Redemption has more realistic graphics, which helps feed into the atmosphere they're trying to create of a more grizzled depiction of the Wild West, while something like Clash of Clans, despite being released 12 years ago, still looks good because of its unique appearance meant to give off a more goofy tone. And that leads me to believe people don't care about the graphics or animation so much as the art style. Civ 5 has more realistic textures, saturation, smaller units, and a somber mood, whereas Civ 6 is much more vibrant, unrealistic, larger and fewer units in the model, and more distinct faces. One game makes you feel like you're venturing out to where no man has gone before, with something like the Fog of War being an actual fog of war, and the other feels like you're playing a mobile game despite being more technically impressive. And that's not a bad thing. The reason it's even dubbed a mobile game is because of the situation around mobile phones. Everyone has one. So to appeal to everyone of all ages, wouldn't it be smarter to create a game with graphics that people of all ages and genders would like, increasing your potential pool of buyers? And Civ 6 decided to take that approach, which has worked wonders, as it is the most popular strategy game by a mile. But the average strategy game fan doesn't want that. They're filled with people who want to feel immersed in the game as if they are a historical leader. And so that's why, despite Civ 6 being graphically superior, the player base of Civ 5 are turned off by the art style and therefore the tone of Civ 6. And that tone isn't just found in the graphics. The more ridiculous nature of the game's mechanics leads to an even bigger divide in the tone set by both games. In Civ 6, you can do more unrealistic things like produce planes in the ancient era, have the warrior able to kill a giant death robot, whereas in Civ 5, no matter how many promotions a warrior has, it would never even be able to beat a musketman. Coupled with different things like the card game for social policies, which could let you have market capitalism and communism, the United Nations in the medieval era, even tooltips like don't settle here since it will flood late game. Like, how the fuck do we know that? We can't even write yet. And while the type of gameplay is more fun to the average person and feeds into the tone they're trying to set, the atmosphere this creates is a polar opposite when compared to Civ 5. And while the reason for this tonal shift is understandable from a sales perspective, it still left behind many players who would rather play Civ 5 than continue with Civ 6. But what is the point of tone if the game itself is inferior? The most important part of a game is of course the gameplay, and this is where the divisions in player base are further exacerbated. And it all starts with leader variety, where Civ 5 blows 6 out of the water. The differences in Civ abilities in Civ 5 are much more pronounced than in 6, with nations such as Venice only able to settle one city, Darius chaining together golden ages, Rome going for conquest before stabilizing the front, Assyria focusing on early war, then using science to snowball, Bismarck using barbs as a defense force, Attila throwing hands on turn 1, Haile Selassie's defense, Harun using gold to back his domination, the Mayan calendar being a whole new mechanic just for the Mayans, even similar civs like Babylon and Korea who focus on science do it in different ways with great scientists and specialists. All of this leads to each leader being specialized uniquely in a single role. And while Civ 6 also has many different play styles, it's not as if every civ is similar to each other. You can see a lot more similarities between certain civs. Chandragupta is played similar to Cyrus, Portugal, Spain, and the Dutch each focus on having traders. The new Congolese leader is exactly like the Mayans but better, making the Mayans irrelevant in most cases. Hungary levies units, as does Norway, Ruzichen, and Catherine both focus on spies. This isn't to say that every leader in Civ 6 is the same, but even the ones that have unique abilities isn't something you can really base your game around or can lead to more complicated strategies. Gandhi gets 5 faith per civ, that's founded a religion, but it's just a minor bonus rather than something you can build your entire game around. This lack of creativity and regurgitation of similar ideas is found in many leaders, and while you do have many like the new Qin Shi Huang, Basil, Hammurabi, or the Maui, even the unique abilities are mostly simple to understand, as Civ 6 focuses more on simplicity rather than distinguished abilities that you can revolve your entire strategy around. Now the reason this was made is obvious. Civ 6 is easier to pick up. Being easier to pick up means you will get more people who might not have been interested in something like Civ 5 to at least try out and get Civ 6 much faster. But the complexity and uniqueness of different Civ 5 leaders makes that game more replayable, despite the fact that a lot of their abilities are more complicated and something that the average player probably isn't going to get as well. But that alone isn't enough, since while Civ 5 has the advantage in that, Civ 6 is still incredibly diverse in its own right with over 70 leaders. But its simplicity is also seen in its diplomacy between leaders and more so with city-states. The influence system in Civ 5 is much more tedious, but also makes a lot more sense. You can't hold on to every city-state as you need to continuously pump in gold or complete missions, else risk your influence falling below 0. But even getting the influence in the first place is more complex than just putting in envoys in the city-states you want. Using gold in Civ 5, especially in the early and mid-game, is just too expensive, and most alliances are made by completing the large variety of quests like destroying camps, killing envoys in the city-states you want, killing barbs, aiding in invasions, researching more technology, securing luxuries, all of which depends on what the city-state needs in that specific time frame. If there is a nearby camp, they'll want you to destroy it. If it can't see a civ's borders, it will ask you to find it for them. And of course, due to this randomness, sometimes the alliances you make aren't what you want. If you trade for a luxury and find another civ by exploring, sometimes you'll make an alliance with a city-state you don't even want, which forces you to play with the hand you're dealt with, so to speak. And while you do have city-state missions in Civ 5, and there is an argument to be made that each city-state is more unique and gives you different bonuses leading to further complexity and depth, the biggest thing about influence is the fact that it decays. You're never going to be able to keep an ally just by completing a few quests for them, leading to a situation in Civ 5 where you're going to be forced to pick between this city-state or the other, whereas in 6, if you have a giant amount of culture, you can blitz through the tech tree and gain a large amount of envoys that way. Meaning while the city-states might be more complex in Civ 6 with their unique abilities, the entire diplomacy aspect of it is much more complex and in-depth in Civilization 5. But despite this more in-depth city-state diplomacy, a situation isn't as pronounced between full-fledged civilizations, but it's still there. Agendas forces you to play a specific way to gain an alliance, and a lot of times it's either something you can't do, like trading luxuries you only have one copy of to the Aztecs, or it just doesn't make sense. Why the hell does Nubia care about how many districts I build? And fulfilling this agenda is usually paramount to gaining that alliance, whereas in Civ 5, they still have something similar to that mechanic B in personalities that sets the aggressiveness and how much of each building each Civ wants and what that Civ is going to do in a specific game. You can set on random personalities, which will randomize what each leader wants to do. Even so, the personalities a lot of the time sets up alliance structures depending on what you want to do. You want a culture victory? Ally against the Egyptians. Everyone denouncing you for being at war? Not Genghis or Shaka, who get reduced negative modifiers against conquest and allows you to make your own Molotov-Ribbentrop pact. That makes sense. But the thing that makes Civ 5 diplomacy more unique is the ideology system, where you gain massive debuffs to relations if you select different ideologies, which I have found isn't as bad in Civ 6. Your historical friend won't denounce you solely for the fact you have democracy and they have communism, which realistically did happen throughout history, where the changing situation set up alliance structures more than anything. England was at war with France throughout its history, at first because of William, a Frenchman's, conquest of England, meaning competing claims between the two as to who would rule over France, then competing claims in American India, and then to stop the French from dominating the continent with Napoleon. But they eventually allied with them when Germany was almost as strong as both France and England combined, at least on land. This shows the changing geopolitical situation and how alliances aren't as simple as they're often made out to be. And while not perfect in Civ 5, it is still much more dynamic and complicated than Civ 6, where your game plan changes depending on both the nearby leaders, as well as the state of the world, instead of just building more units than Clio to secure an alliance for the entire game. And again, this isn't necessarily inferior than Civ 5, as its simplicity makes the game more accessible to the average person, but the hardcore strategy gamer will find it too surface level to resonate with as compared to Civ 5, or even something like EU4, which has almost perfect diplomacy. And when diplomacy breaks down and nation-states are at war, the depth of combat in Civilization 6 is again more simplistic than Civ 5, despite its similarities. Both games use promotions to show veterancy of certain units, making them more effective than green recruits. But the way they're done in Civ 5 is again more realistic, and most importantly more varied. You can observe that in the first promotion, where you're given a choice, heal instantly or gain a combat bonus in certain types of terrain. That same choice is absent in Civ 6, where you heal every promotion, and the difference is this gives the player a choice as compared to Civ 6, where getting the promotion is superior long term, but what if your unit is on the ropes? What if you almost have a city and want to heal instantly to secure its capture? But even the certain promotions in Civ 5 are less centralized and more separated. You can gain the medic promotion to heal nearby units, amphibious to eliminate river crossings, armor plating for defense, charge for wounded units, march to keep healing every turn even if you move, sentry for visibility, the list goes on. This lets you specialize units for certain situations. You want to have special forces for amphibious landings, siege troops to take out cities, a designated combat medic to increase healing per turn, and even when you're going for a combat bonus, it still requires a choice. Do you want a rough terrain or a open terrain bonus? And while Civ 6 has much of the same abilities like amphibious or siege, most of the abilities just give you combat strength in certain situations and less utility. This all leads to a situation where unit promotions may be stronger in Civ 6 and are much easier to understand, but the thinking behind them based on what you need is a lot less than in Civ 5, where every promotion requires you to juggle multiple things you want, where you can only choose one at a time. And this can be found behind the unit variety variety in Civilization 5 between heavy cavalry, light cavalry, melee, spears, and ranged. The same classes do exist in Civ 6, but due to one big reason, there really isn't a choice in most circumstances, and that is in how strong the cities are. In Civ 6, as you know, they made cities much weaker. They don't start with a ranged attack before walls, and just having 3 to 4 melee units of the current era is usually enough to take the city. This leads to usually the best playstyle being to build some ranged units and the strongest melee unit you can field, whether that be cav or infantry. The only real difference is whether the city has walls or not, and even that isn't much of a choice. Use infantry and battering rams early game where cavalry can't use siege equipments, and catapults are too weak. Then when the Renaissance walls come into play, infantry becomes obsolete, and you need siege engines, meaning it's smarter to just have stronger and faster cavalry to take out the city. In Civ 5, cavalry are atrocious at taking cities with a negative 33% debuff, and ranged units again struggle at taking the stronger cities found in Civ 5, where no unit except actual catapults can do decent damage to any sort of city. But siege units can't take out units effectively and need a turn to set up before attacking. So now you need to add in archers to take out units. But what if the enemy has cavalry or keshiks of themselves? Despite the fact that, like in Civ 6, spearmen are the weakest unit in Civ 5, the difference is that they almost always win a 1v1 against cavalry and have a use, whereas in Civ 6, the spearmen, even with the bonus to cav, is a lot of the times a lot weaker than cavalry in a one-on-one scenario unless they're fortified. This leads to each game in Civ 5 requiring a different composition depending on who you're up against, whereas in Civ 6 the fighting strength matters a lot more in most cases. This leaves people who are used to Civ 5 and the meticulous unit composition and choice of promotions you can create depending on the situation to be alienated by Civ 6, where there is a meta you very rarely deviate from, where siege is bad early, melee bad late, and spears are quite honestly completely useless unless you literally have zero resources. But the benefit of such a system is the fact that it is simpler to understand and is more appealing to people who aren't very into strategy games to start with. The depth being removed for accessibility extends to the tall versus wide debate in both games. For those of you who don't know, tall means less cities that are stronger, while wide is having as many cities as you can. The biggest reason for this divide in Civ 5 is twofold. Happiness, we'll get to that later, being more restrictive than amenities, and the cost of techs and social policies going up substantially for every city you own. These two factors means that playing with 4 really strong cities is just as viable as building as many cities as you can. Your techs cost less than in a wide game, and if you start with a poor start where you can only really build 3 to 4 good cities, you'll still be able to compete with other more blessed locations. But the problem with playing tall is that there's less room for error on a build path. You have less cities, so you're forced to optimize each one to a certain extent to make up for your lack of numbers. For example, for most tall games, you're not going to be building barracks or caravanseries, focusing more on libraries and monuments. But what if you have a militaristic neighbor nearby? You have less cities to build units, so you have to balance building a defense force with building up the infrastructure you so desperately need to keep up with wider civs. Wide games, on the other hand, are less restrictive in what you need to build, since you have so many cities that even being caught unprepared by an enemy means that in 10 to 20 turns you can build up a whole new army from scratch. But now you'll have to deal with the happiness penalties, which can be crippling if you do go for something like 20 cities. They will have less population, reducing your potential research when combined with the research penalty from having so many cities. So whether you go tall or wide is dependent on the game you're in. If you have plenty of arable land you want to settle, go wide. If you're locked off, then it's better to hunker down and focus on making cities as strong as possible. Now contrast that with Civ 6 with amenities and no debuff to culture or science. More cities equals more yields equals better. Now, me personally, I love Civ 6's approach much more simply because you can conquer and snowball a lot faster than in Civ 5, which almost forces you to play tall in some cases, which is going to be boring for the average person who doesn't like taking 20 minutes to come up with a decision. But again, it means that you almost have to play wide in Civ 6 and settle 8 to 10 cities or you can't win the game, forcing you down the same path every time, which again, Civ 5 veterans might find too simplistic as opposed to the having to take in different factors players on whether to go wide or tall, as while the turn your brain off and conquer the world is objectively more fun for the general audience, it removes the strategic thinking Civ 5 players love so much. And a big part of the tall versus wide debate is due to the age-old question, tradition, or liberty that accentuates tall and wide styles, which brings us neatly to where the removal of strategic depth is most pronounced. The way both games handle culture and social policies. Now in Civ 6 you have a separate tech tree which works just like the science tree where all the cultural and religious buffs are found. Now this is a point to Civ 6 where it actually is something that has more depth than in Civ 5. Having two separate trees with two separate resources means you have to think about sacrificing culture for science or vice versa, whereas even in a cultural game in Civ 5, you sort of need to focus on science to get the wonders. The problem comes when you compare social policies between both games, where Civ 6 replaced the policy tree with the card game. Now while many people complain about the card game simply because it's a card game you'd find in a mobile game, that doesn't mean it's objectively worse, since you do have to make choices on which government you want, which policies you want, versus whether you want the bonus to combat oligarchy provides, versus the domestic buffs Classical Republic gives. The problem is the fact that in 99% of games, economic slots are much better than the other two, and from there you just plug in the policy which gives the highest number of yields. When compared with Civ 5, even just with the first 4 starting trees, the decision you have is more strategic. It might seem simple on the surface, tradition for playing tall, liberty for wide, honor for military, piety for faith. But what if I can't build a settler because of early barbarians? Is beelining the settler and worker for liberty better to save time? What if there are a lot of barbs? Honor would pay for itself. If I want to play Shaka, maybe go tradition earlier for a stronger base, and then dip into honor for military, and then finally liberty to get bonuses towards building wide. Maybe you want a religion, but you have to deal with building settlers to conquer all this great territory you have started with, and then maybe a different civilization like the Aztecs decides to declare war on you. Should you go piety for quicker religion or risk not getting one at all? The combination and choices depends on your game state, or you might even go for a suboptimal policy just to build the wonder it provides, like the pyramids in tradition. Despite that, there is one policy tree you almost always go down: rationalism. But even that has a major question you need to answer. With it only being unlocked in the Renaissance era, do you finish the tree to get the massive science bonuses, or do you continue down your ideology tree? Which leads us to the most important policies in the game being ideology. Super powerful social policies where each one specializes in certain fields. Just like Civ 6 Tier 3 governments, but there's a catch: the happiness modifier. You see, if you pick an ideology and another Civ with much higher culture, or multiple other Civs pick a different ideology, you get a happiness debuff, which isn't just 1 or 2, but can go up to -20 or even 40 in certain cases. This, combined with happiness being more catastrophic in Civ 5, will halt the growth and production of your empire if you're not careful. So why not pick the most popular ideology? Well, if you are the first adopter of an ideology, you gain 2 free policies, and 1 free policy if you're the second adopter. And maybe you're going for a domination victory and want autocracy, but everyone went order. Do you pick autocracy or go down an ideology tree you can't really use to save your happiness, which is the limiting factor in domination for most games? Do you go for the 2 free policies in the suboptimal ideology tree? And just as important, do you have any allies who would be alienated by your ideological choice? Even ideologies with just 3 choices on the surface require so much deliberation on the potential benefits and trade-offs you need to compare that it just feels like a downgrade to most Civ 5 players when they play Civ 6 and use its policy cards. All of these mechanics in leaders, diplomacy, combat, culture, and city settling are more complicated in Civ 5, which is great for the hardcore strategy gamers, but would provide too big a hurdle to people who just really aren't interested in these types of mechanics. And so Firaxis simplified these systems for Civ 6, but that alienated the hardcore gamers who decided to stick with Civ 5. But despite the game Civ 6 being simpler, one of the most important factors, the AI, is made much, much worse in Civ 6 by a decision that actually increased strategic depth: the districts. You see, in Civ 6, they've added districts, which separates the type of buildings you can normally build in Civ 5. To build science buildings, you need a campus. To build production, you need an industrial zone. Now, I know what you might be thinking. This strategic depth would be right up the alley of Civ 5 players, right? Well, yes, but the problem is this one change completely broke the AI. You see, the amount of districts you can build depends on your population, and most cities can't build more than 3 districts in the early game. Why is this a problem? Well, the human player can build the optimal district districts for their preferred victory type, but the AI can't. They're just not smart enough and will usually build a high-yield theater square when they're going for a domination victory, or they'll build the first district or cheapest district they can find, whether that be the entertainment complex or the encampment. So if you're a human player and you can just snowball by building 10 campuses in all 10 of your cities, whereas the AI will only build 4 or 5. But this is made up for with all the bonuses the AI gets in the higher difficulties, right? Well, again, no. You see, it's not just the amount of districts, but also the quality of the districts, which can be improved by policy cards to where you can have a campus produce up to 32 science, when surrounded by mountains, doubled with natural philosophy, and increased by 50% with rationalism. But the AI can't plan ahead. They don't say, okay, I'll put a government plaza here so I can buy that tile later and place a campus there. They might see a +2 mountain for campus or put a theater square beside a wonder, but a good human player will routinely have all the districts be at minimum +4 by planning for them all the way back in turn 1. The AI can't do that, and the lack of quality districts along with the quantity of districts means that even with yields doubled, the human can't easily outperform the AI using pins to place cities and districts in their most optimal locations, which really isn't a factor for more casual players who a lot of the times won't be playing on deity, but simply due to how long the game has been out and the fact that only the most hardcore players are going to be playing Civ 5, I'd assume that 99% of that player base is playing on deity. 99% of that player base is good at the game. 99% of that player base could come into Civ 6 and learn how to beat deity in about 5 or so hours. And so despite this advantage and strategic depth Civ 6 provides, the fact it can't be optimally used by the AI means those hardcore players will find even deity a joke after a certain time, the type of hardcore gamer that would decide to stick with Civ 5 over Civ 6. But before we continue, if you enjoyed the video, subscribe for the channel to not miss out on future Civilization documentaries where I take a deep dive into previous Civ games. And so we can see that the major changes they made for Civ 6, the major problem Civ 5 players still have is centered around one principle: depth versus accessibility. And this difference between both games can be found in the community. More hardcore fans are more likely to join in on discussion with the game and create mods, just due to the fact that they've spent thousands of hours and will eventually fall into the rabbit hole of Reddit and forums, and most importantly, are more likely to routinely discuss the game with like-minded players. Whereas the average Civ 6 player might lightly read or participate in discussion for the game, but will more likely than not get bored eventually and go play another game after a little while, only to come back and repeat the process a year or two later. But how does a more vibrant community lead to a better experience? Mods. Vox Populi is the greatest Civilization mod ever made, where it rebalances every aspect of the game in civilization, social policies, and more for more competitive play, and most importantly, a more even experience between civs. There's also a Civ 4 diplomacy mod, which further advances the diplomatic game with such things as vassals, and combined with it being out longer than Civ 6, and the fact that it took years for Firaxis to release the modding tools for Civ 6 in the first place, means there are more mods for Civ 6, and for the most part, more quality mods that you could do to change the game as opposed to Civ 6 mods, which are mainly focused around different civilizations. And looking at Skyrim alone proves that mods can be the difference between a great game and an all-time classic people keep playing 20 years later. So even with less players, the community Civ 5 has been able to cultivate makes people want to stay a part of it for longer, as opposed to Civ 6. So it's pretty safe to say that Civ 5 completely outclasses Civ 6 in everything, right? Well, no. Despite the many positives, my main focus in this video was to answer the question of why Civ 5 players might prefer that game over Civ 6. But there are still many advantages Civ 6 has over its predecessor, aside from the fact that it's more accessible for newer players who might not be into strategy games in the first place. For example, games in Civilization 5 take much longer. This Babylon game I had was a standard science victory where I was up to 3 hours before I decided to quit, as it would have likely taken me another hour or an hour and a half to finish the game. And that hour and a half is a huge problem everyone has with Civ 5, being the utter slog that is in the late game. Now, while there is a slog in Civ 6's late game, it usually goes by a lot faster, as that game only really takes up to an hour and a half, 2 hours if you really rush it. Not only that, but there are two mechanics that Civ 6 is superior in my opinion. Loyalty is a great mechanic that makes it so that border gore isn't as big of an issue, happiness system is too punishing, and conquering a vast empire is much more rewarding in Civ 6. And while each game has its pros and cons, which game do I think is better personally? That depends. Civ 6 is better for conquest, snowballing, and dominating the world, but 5 is better in terms of replayability and immersiveness. But on a personal scale, I'd rather play Civ 6, despite the fact fact, I do think Civ 5 is a much better game mechanically for what it's trying to do. Civ 6 is, for me at least, more fun, and while I've spent this video explaining why Civ 5 is better for a lot of people, the sheer amount of things you can do in Civ 6 is more fun, like in this video where I make my starting warrior stronger than a giant death robot.